listening to Tech Reads, interviews with emerging technology thought leaders. Our sponsor is SoftTech, the premier technology trade association that has been serving northern Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo County since 1997. Our mission is to create SoftTech moments where people connect, explore ideas, and create new business opportunities. Learn more at softec.org.
Hello, everyone. This is Brian Schwartz from SoftTech, and I'm very excited for our speakers today. We'll have them introduce themselves, but I'm here in San Luis Obispo. My name is Brian Schwartz. I'm here with Troy and John. We have Bob Dumichal on the phone from Arroyo Grande, and Jeffrey from Santa Cruz, and Douglas from the UK. And this will be released as a podcast, as they always are. I often forget to thank our sponsors, so I'm just going to make a quick shout out to some of our sponsors of SoftTech, our Santa Maria Valley Chamber of Commerce. Story Labs is where we host these tech reads. Santa Maria Airport, iFixit, Torchlight Marketing, Cesslock Federal Credit Union, Astound, which has been rolling out fiber networks all across the Central Coast, and CIO Solutions, as well as others. So I recommend you check out our website. But with that, I'm very excited. The topic today and the authors of Agile Conversations are going to enlighten us to something that we may be familiar with from a software development perspective, but haven't maybe applied it in the real world and in our conversations. And I've written up some questions, but I'll be encouraging our guest to chime in as well. And Bob is about halfway through the book, so he'll probably have a few questions as well. But why don't we start with introductions? Jeffrey, why don't you go first and just tell us who you are and where you're at?
Sure. So Jeffrey Fredrick, born in Silicon Valley, spent much of my career here, did spend 10 years over in the UK, where I was at a fintech company, where along with Squirrel for part of that time. Kind of through my career, I've gone back and forth between, I'd say, the technology business divide. So been an engineer, QA engineer, documentation, as well as, being in product management and marketing, and kind of go back and forth between those two different roles. Currently, 4 days a week, I'm VP of engineering for a fintech company called Analytics. And then 1 day a week, I do coaching for executives and executive teams.
Awesome. Thank you. And Douglas?
Well, so I'm Douglas Squirrel. Most people call me Squirrel. You're welcome to call me Douglas. I'm happy with either name. They both work. There's just lots of Douglases and not many Squirrels. So take your pick.
Not the speaking kind anyway.
So I've been coding for about 40 years, and I'm probably 45 now. I haven't done the maths recently. Yeah, 45 years. And I've been some kind of senior technical leader for 25 of those. So CTO, head of engineering, VP of engineering, all those kinds of titles. And I kept getting fired from all those roles, including the one where I hired Jeffrey, and he replaced me. And every time I got fired, the founder, the CEO, would come to me and say, "Squirrel, you've built this great team. They're doing a fantastic job. You've trained someone to lead them. They seem to be so productive. It's just incredible. And gee, you're kind of expensive, and there's not much for you to do. So would you please go away and be wonderful somewhere else?" And this was a very nice way to get fired. But the third or fourth time I said, hang on, there's a pattern here. I should do something. So I became a consultant. And now I've worked with, I think the latest count is 193 different companies in about 8 years. So I move very fast. I help them very quickly, and I work with them on exactly the topics we're going to be talking about today, how to make software teams productive by having better conversations. And the last thing I'll say is I also run a community of people who are interested in that. I'm sure we'll talk more about how that works, but that's a free resource that I have to give back to the community to make sure that lots and lots of people learn about how to make their tech teams much more productive and profitable.
I love it. Bob, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself and as president of SoftTech?
Sure. I'm the president of SoftTech. I have a small business that does t-shirt imprints for military themed t-shirts, as you can tell from my attire. And but I've been in the tech field for about 40 years, and this is now my 8th startup. So I've been through that process many times, and I've fired myself before, so don't feel bad.
I don't feel bad at all. Best thing that ever happened to me.
That's kind of my story. I've been involved with SoftTech for about 25 years now. This is
Thank
my
you, Bob.
third time as president.
Fantastic. I just have one thing to check. You might edit this out in the podcast. I'm not sure, but I just realized, can you hear me okay? And do you hear any other sound? This house is 600 years old. It was not designed with Zoom in mind. Do I sound okay?
It sounds great. Yeah. No
Excellent.
worries.
Good news. Then
Yeah.
we'll keep going.
Thanks for checking. So before I get into some of the content and the specifics I've picked up in the book, again, it's Agile Conversations, transform your conversations, transform your culture. Maybe just set the stage about the different conversations and maybe at a really high level, if it's even possible, a briefer on what Agile is. And I actually wrote down maybe the simplest way, and tell me if this is accurate. Agile is having the capacity to embrace change. Is that an accurate kind of most basic foundational explanation?
Yeah, I like it. It also happens to be the subtitle of XP Explained by Kent Beck, the White Book 1.0 back in 2000 or whatever, shortly before the Agile Manifesto was signed. The subtitle of that was Embrace Change. Right. So you're getting a classic definition there.
And it's equanimity. I like that because I'm a mindfulness practitioner, and I think it's having that equanimity in the real world. But of course, it stems from software. But so you've taken something that has been used for software development and you've evolved it into, again, the working communication of one another. So maybe just preface us a little bit about what the bare bones foundation someone needs to know if they want to know if this is the right book for them to pick up. Maybe start with Squirrel.
Yep. You can call me either one. They really both work. Oh, and I should show off. I just got a delivery of this. This is the Chinese version of the book. So if anybody wants to read it in Chinese, there you go. I just have 5 copies. So you have to show that off. But here's the main thing: is equanimity and mindfulness are fantastic things. I'm all in favor of them. But we're gonna, if you read our book, you're going to have more productive conflict. You're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to feel stupid. So if you're not prepared to do any of those things, if that's going to shake your equanimity, then maybe work on some more mindfulness first. But if you'd like to feel really uncomfortable and that most things that are going wrong in your organization are your fault, then our book would be really good to read.
I like it. And conflict, I have had this conversation on more than one occasion where organizations and successful companies thrive on conflict. In fact, if you go in for an interview with Amazon and you think conflict is something to avoid, you will definitely not get the job because they're seeking people who thrive in that world and challenging each other and understanding and sort of turning the idea that conflict is something we should avoid. I'm curious what your take is on that, sort of making that mind shift.
Well, the key thing is the word productive. So there's an adjective in front of conflict. So there's the type of conflict, which I think Jeff Bezos is pretty famous for, where you call somebody in and scream at them for a while, and then somehow they become more productive. That works for some people. I'm never going to argue with success. So that's not what our book's about. Our book is about discovering the conflicts that already exist that people cover up and hide from and are skillfully incompetent at dealing with. And they manage to create situations where, for example, their tech team is working on the wrong thing for 6 months or a year, delivers something, and customers hate it. And you think, how did that happen? Where did that come from? Or the marketing team refuses to do any branding tracking because they say, look, customers don't pay attention to surveys. It's all wrong. We won't do it. And then their brand isn't doing well. Wherever they might be working in an ineffective way, almost always at the root of that is some conflict that is occurring that is being handled in an unproductive way. It's either being hidden or there's screaming or there's something else that is harmful. So our book is all about how not to do that. Maybe Jeffrey wants to pick up there.
No, I think that's great. And I think because if we go back to what you said earlier in the beginning, like the ideas and principles of Agile are pretty simple and common sense. And so there's a sort of weird paradox. If they're so simple and straightforward, why aren't people doing them? Like, why aren't they getting better? It's not a lack of knowledge. It's a lack of ability to execute. What prevents the group of people from executing better? And it usually comes as the ability to converse in a way that taps into all the wisdom of everyone and so that they get smarter as a collection, that the diversity of experiences become a strength rather than diversity being a source of unproductive conflict. So that's the fundamental problem we're trying to solve, is what makes a group of people essentially stupid, or otherwise, to be a little bit less negative, what prevents them from being their best collection of selves? And usually it's a lack of skill in conversations. And I think that's the other message from our book, is productive conversations are a skill, which means they require practice. So it's a little bit like if you're going to learn how to play piano. Learning piano is also a skill. I can explain to you the theory of a piano. I can explain that the strings are different lengths and the different lengths make different sounds. And I can explain how you push a key and a hammer strikes the string and it makes a sound and vibrates. You can understand a piano completely in 5 or 10 minutes. That doesn't make you able to play piano. To be able to play piano professionally requires practice over a period of time. Conversations are the same. But there's a challenge with this, which is people aren't aware of their lack of skill in conversations. If you're learning a lot of things that have skill involved, when you make a mistake, you can see it, right? If I'm playing tennis and I hit the ball in the net, I see it. Oh, that was not good. If I hit the ball, out of the court, oh, that wasn't so good. If I'm learning to ski and I fall down, I'm getting the feedback. Conversations, we get very little feedback because of the way our minds work. We will tend to look at the failures of conversations as someone else's fault rather than our own, and that prevents us from learning. So in a nutshell, the book is about the techniques of how you can learn to develop your own skill, but that to do so goes back to what Squirrel mentioned earlier. That's going to be uncomfortable because now you need to take the mindset of like, what could I be doing differently? Where do I lack skill and how could I improve? So that's kind of my summary of the motivation and what the book is about. So that might resonate with some people. I'll say that the final what I say is like final description I'll give is people who've read the book tell us one of two things. They'll say like, oh, I really enjoyed the book. I really enjoyed reading it. And then the other people say, wow, it took me a lot longer than I expected. I had to do these exercises and it was kind of hard. Well, the second group of people are getting a lot more out of it than the first. We're very happy when people enjoy it, but the people who say like, oh, I had to struggle a bit, like those are the people who are actually developing the skill.
And putting it into practice. And early in the book, you talk about the 4 R's. Why don't you share a little bit about that, how that's a core part of the strategy of practicing, would you say?
Yeah. So our practice model that we came up with was kind of derived from what we've seen in applying different modes and models of communication. And we said, look, across any of the different models you might be trying to apply, there are 4 steps that we see as important. And they are to record the conversation, to reflect on the conversation, which is kind of just score it, and then to revise the conversation. And then ideally, you do some role play to practice speaking those things. And then you might repeat that and even do role reversal. So there's the 6 4 R's, but it's not a math book. It's on conversation. So it kind of works.
And that recording, it doesn't mean that you necessarily record the conversation like we're doing this, although that does serve some purpose. It's more that you're replaying the conversation at a later date.
Yeah, we have a
not quite. Not quite. Hang on. So there's a common misunderstanding, and people who are listening to the podcast might not have seen that you were pointing to your head.
Yeah.
That's the danger.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a very important thing that comes about when you, and this is what distinguishes the 2 groups of people Jeffrey talked about, the people who say, oh, it was a nice read, or the people who say, but it was painful. The painful ones are the ones who get a piece of paper, that's the key part, and they write on the piece of paper what happened in the conversation. It doesn't have to be recorded with a tape recorder, a phone or anything, or on Zoom, but it does mean that you need to write it down. And the thing that happens is called self-distancing. It's not social distancing. We've all got very used to that. This is self-distancing, where you look at yourself as another human being. And when you do that, when you get it down on the piece of paper, that's when you can create the feedback that Jeffrey was talking about. So there's a great story about this. There's a wonderful guy named Benjamin Mitchell who helped Jeffrey and I to learn a lot of this. We worked on a lot of the material on this topic together to learn it and develop it. And he would go around, he would actually tape them. This was before the days of phones, smartphones. So he would record with an actual physical tape player, and he'd go back to his hotel room. He was a consultant traveling around, and he'd play the tape of the conversation,
and transcribe
trying
it
to learn from it. and transcribe it while he was doing it. But in addition to transcribing it, he would also periodically notice what an idiot he was. And he would say, oh my God, Benjamin, stop doing that. Remember, his name is Benjamin. He's talking to Benjamin himself, but he's talking to the guy inside the tape recorder. And because he can distance himself in that way, he can get a much better result in analyzing, because you feel like your brain operates in a different way with others than it does with yourself. And so that's the crucial notion is, yes, you need to record it, but record it on paper or on a screen or something else that is outside yourself. That will get you the best benefits.
And that should be done on a fairly timely basis. You don't want to wait too long, because by the time a few days have gone by, you probably remember 10% of what actually
doesn't matter.
Okay.
Doesn't matter, because when you write it down, even weeks or months later, there's a wonderful thing which saves you from the challenge you think you have, which is, oh my gosh, I can't remember, what did Bob say and what did I say and what did Jeffrey say, and I don't remember. But the thing is, it's going to all pass through your brain as it goes onto the piece of paper, and your brain is the problem. So your brain is doing the wrong thing. So because it passes through your brain, you will make the same mistakes. So whatever Bob said that really ticked you off, you're going to write down, Bob said this thing, and I'm really ticked off at this, and I can't believe it. And then you're going to yell at Bob on the paper. You may not yell at Bob the same way, but you're going to yell at Bob. And that will help you to understand whether your yelling was effective. Maybe it was, or much more likely, there's a different way of approaching the situation.
Yeah, you're more objective, which is what's the challenge, right?
That's the self-distancing. Then it helps you to understand it better. But it doesn't matter whether you get it right.
So that explains all the times that you yell at me.
I think taking accountability for everything, basically personal responsibility for things when they're not working out well is a key part of it, right? Where I think you bring that up in the very beginning is, we're part of the problem. It's not like we can put this on someone else. I just jotted down, and I'll get to a couple of my other questions, but do you, in the book, I haven't gotten to it yet, but you do kind of have specific prescriptions for people who are struggling in certain ways? And I'll speak for myself. When I'm getting impatient, I have a tendency to interrupt people. And my wife reminds me every time it happens. She scowls me because I speak up, but I'm like, this person never stops talking. So I have to interrupt them in order to get some word in edgewise. Is there like...
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
See, I'm doing it with permission there. Jeffrey has a wonderful story about this. So I just wonder if Jeffrey could tell his great story.
Oh, which one? You need to prompt me.
It involves your hand.
Oh, okay, yes. So I think that, one of the things that happens here is, as you do these reflections, these 4R ideas, you end up with, like on my desk in front of me, I have lots of these pieces of paper, which have 2 columns and where I've done conversational analysis. As you do many of them, you start to notice habits and patterns. And we divide kind of the ideas into 3 things, twitches, triggers, and tells. And the idea is that a twitch would be sort of a habit, a way that you tend to go, right? And so different people have different twitches. They'll tend to maybe ask questions or be silent or interrupt, different sort of habits of behavior. A trigger is something outside of you that causes a certain reaction. And so you might learn that there's certain scenarios that generate certain responses from you. And then there's tells, which are things that you can notice about yourself to realize that you're doing a certain pattern. So one of the things I noticed, and this is what Squirrel mentioned, was that I had a habit of saying in conversations, of course, it's obvious, whatever. And I would do it while raising my hand. And this is the tell. And it's like
specifically your right hand?
It was left hand. Always my left hand.
Okay. Yep.
So obviously, this actually would say was this. I'd say obviously, da 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 da. But then so what I learned was, if I notice my hand in the air, I'd be like, wait, why is my hand there? Oh, I just said obviously. And then and this is the key idea. I'd have a pre-planned action. When this happened, what would I do? Oh, it's not obvious. Let me explain. Right? That was it. That was the pre-planned action. The idea here is that by understanding our conversational patterns, we can start to develop pre-planned actions and practice them. So when the moment comes, I now have a different available action to me. So in your scenario, you might realize, oh, I feel a desire to interrupt. How could I do so skillfully? Or what would be right? Is that the right thing to do? And you give yourself more options by generating these pre-planned actions, these scenarios, rather than trying to work them out in advance or in the moment. You have them worked out in advance so that when it comes to the time, that you can then execute them. So much like any kind of other scenario of skill, you plan for it as opposed to just going with your instinct, which will give you predictably the same thing you've been doing for many years. You've practiced that style of interruption that you use for many years. Of course, unless you practice something else, you're going to keep doing that. So in the book, we describe essentially this in this 4 R's in that revision. You can say, do I like this way? Do I like that way? I can experiment with different ways till I find some wording or approach that I like, and then see what happens from there.
I remember growing up, we had the talking stick because kids would interrupt each other, and the teachers would basically say, all right, we're using a talking stick. Until you have the stick, you cannot speak. And so they would like try to hurry up and get the talking stick so that they could speak their mind. But I love that. So there are some specific, I mean, the process does allow us to look into our own unique drawbacks or just, tendencies as we communicate with other people.
That's the key thing, which I just want to point out about the talking stick method. Great method. Glad it works. Certainly helps and is a useful one. It doesn't go far enough. So lots of organizations try talking stick kind of approaches. And they say, oh, what we need is a different structure. What we need is another meeting. This is how you get so many meetings. We need another meeting. And that's where we'll get these people together. And finally, they'll talk. And when you create a structure, you create the opportunity for something to happen, but you don't make it happen. What happened, this is what we get into in a lot further on in the book, is what are the steps you can take to build trust? How can you remove fear? How can you get real commitment? How can you be accountable? Those things actually remove the barriers to people doing the talking or ceasing to interrupt. It's the emotions and the feelings and the challenges that people have that they don't express, that don't come out in productive conflict, that lead to that. And something like the talking stick gives you the opportunity, doesn't necessarily resolve the problem.
And one of the challenges I think we face today that's more unique, especially since COVID, is the multiple channels of communication, the asynchronous channels like Microsoft Teams, WhatsApp, email, and still dealing with phone and face-to-face meetings. I mean, I talked to an executive, he's like, I don't even know how to do this anymore because we're being bombarded in so many different directions. And the urgency of some of these methods are like much faster. And I'm just curious, you guys touch on that just briefly, that this is an issue you see. I'm curious what your advice is for people who are struggling with this.
My view is that what's really made the difference is that it's not all these additional channels. It's the loss of the in-person face-to-face time. And the reason is it's during face-to-face time in the real world where people will build relationships in a sort of organic fashion, right? They learn to get to be comfortable with each other to some way. Maybe people go to lunch together, they get coffee together, maybe they go out for beer after work together, and they start to, this is the way humans are, we're social primates. And so we begin to develop a sense of each other. And then that translates later into higher trust communication, right? So that's often, if you look at the phrase that people often use for team formation, they'd say, was it forming, storming, norming, performing, right? You go through this cycle where you develop relationships with people that then allow you to be productive later. I think what's happened is it's not so much the addition of all the different channels of communication, but it's been the loss of that, what the historic way that people have built trust, where they learn to start being vulnerable and disclose a bit more about themselves and learn a bit more about the other people. So they have some empathy that then later comes out in these conversations. So my belief is you can build that kind of trust deliberately, skillfully. and once you have developed that trust, now the challenge of the different media becomes much less. Because that's really what it is to you. It's not that these, in my experience, not that the media have different demands, but that people don't know how to build trust when they're not face-to-face.
Think about how you might correspond with, say, your wife over a text message or something like that, and how you might correspond with a boss or a client or someone like that. Those interactions are different, especially if it's someone new in the work world. Your interactions will be different. You might feel greater urgency or less of an ability to come back with a productive conflict. Hey, wait a minute, that doesn't work for me. But you've already told us that your wife feels pretty comfortable telling you you're interrupting her. So
kicking me under the table. Yes,
exactly. Perfect. So that's something you can do in person. You can also do it online. And so this is a place where I'll disagree with Jeffrey. I live in, as I said, a 600-year-old house far out from and the civilization. My main neighbors are 700 sheep who live over there. So I'm online all day, and that's the only, I've never met many of my clients and never will. And I build trust with them very, very rapidly. But I do that very skillfully because I've practiced for years and years and years how to do that. And I've done all these methods that help me to do that effectively. And it is harder work, and it does require a greater level of skill to do it. But you can do it without meeting people at all. So I'm not so worried about whether we're meeting in person. I'm worried about whether all the means of communication we're using are used in a way that's effective, that builds trust rather than destroys it.
I don't think we're disagreeing, Squirrel. I think you and I are totally agreeing. I'm saying that the point you use the key word is that you're using these skills you developed. And I say most people don't lack those skills. So that's what we're trying to teach in the book, is skills to essentially have happen deliberately and skillfully what people normally can only accomplish sometimes by accident. Right. So it's
easier in person to do it by accident.
It's easier and more natural. And that's why one of the Agile principles that people often use is co-locate teams. Get them all sitting together. Why? Because it works with human nature. People are more likely to develop positive relationships with people they're sitting around talking to all day than when they're separated by cubicles, even 30 feet. That's, that people who are that far apart won't have the same relationship with people who are working 5 feet or 10 feet apart. So that's just, it will happen for some people more naturally when they're together. And they don't know how to do the same thing skillfully when it doesn't come naturally to them. And that's the difference, is what happens when there's a tendency to happen things organically, but then alternatively, you can do it skillfully.
Well, and I'm looking at throughout your book, and I was really impressed that Jeffrey brought up the piece of paper where he has the 2 columns. Throughout the whole book, you basically have this very simple exercise, which is what the person thought and felt, and then what the conversation actually occurred. Have you ever tried to use this like in real time?
Oh, yeah.
And does that help?
Yeah, we have, Jeffrey. I seem to remember doing so. Maybe I'm wrong.
I'm trying to think in real time. I think that where it comes out I think that's part of what happens is you're developing the skill to be aware of the difference, right? So you earlier made the reference to mindfulness. And I think that's what this habit builds. When you practice it offline, you become aware of the difference between what is being said and your thoughts and feelings. And the problem is actually humans normally are very bad at this. And you talked about time earlier, 20 minutes, the research is something like this, 20 minutes after a conversation, people don't remember the difference between what was said, what was implied, or what they inferred, right? In other words, the things that were explicitly spoken versus the things that they just derived, they don't remember the difference. And often in the conversation, we're so caught up in our own view of the world, our own interpretation of what we meant, that actually we're not aware of what we say. And actually, this is the strong form of it. In a conversation, normally, you are unaware of what you actually say. Because what you're listening to is actually the thoughts in your head, which don't come out of your mouth. And there's a good analogy here, which they did a study with some people where they had them tap out a tune. They thought of a song that everyone knows, something like "Happy Birthday to You." And they said, okay, now tap it out on the table.
Mm-hmm.
And then they said, how likely do you think the listener will be able to guess what you were tapping? And people thought, I don't know, 30, 40% of the time. The actual numbers were like 5% of the time. So basically, no one would guess. Now, why the discrepancy? It's because the person doing the tapping wasn't hearing the tapping. They were hearing the tune in their head. But the listener is only hearing the tapping on the table. And they're like, I have no idea. This is what happens in our conversations. There are words that we're speaking that we don't hear them. We hear the thoughts going on in our head, but the recipient only hear the words coming out of our mouth. So one of the big insights that happens is, these things are different. Actually, when I look at the page, I realize I didn't say the most important thing to me. I just didn't say it. I didn't ask any questions. I wasn't aware of that. And so as you develop that awareness through the practice, then in real time, it's a little bit like real-time mindfulness. It's not a little bit like it. It's exactly that. You become aware of, I haven't actually said this. You become aware of the gaps. Oh, I haven't explained my reasoning and intent for what I'm doing. Oh, I haven't asked them why they're suggesting this. Oh, maybe I'll ask them, why are you suggesting it? What in your history made you think this is a good idea? Clearly there must be something. I don't know what it is. Can you tell me what was that? And you become, therefore, that I think that's the real-time application. It's not that I'm writing things down in real time, but rather I become more aware of this separation between the said and the unsaid.
Bob, you had something?
Well, I'm curious because one of the early recommendations was that after the conversation, you write it down.
Yeah.
And you're going to write down the part that was in your head, not what was in the meeting after the fact. And so
Yep.
if you don't record it, and even if you do record it, you're not picking up all the nonverbals, which are a huge percentage of the communication to begin with.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you get this all to work. If you're recording the conversation and studying it after the fact, you're doing your perception of what I said is what you heard, which isn't necessarily the case. And so
This is
I'm
what I was
curious how
saying
you
before.
handle those dilemmas.
Sorry, I thought you were done. This is what I was saying before, so I'm going to maybe let Jeffrey explain it in maybe a slightly different way, because it really doesn't matter. It's surprising. This is not an obvious fact, but it actually doesn't matter. Jeffrey, do you want to?
What doesn't matter?
Well, so
The nonverbals and the whether you get exactly right what was said and whether you're giving your perceptions. That doesn't matter for your learning. You can learn just as well.
So the key insight is going to be something like this. Typically, we are so bad at conversations that we don't need the level of fidelity that would come from a real recording. And I'll make an analogy here with painting. So I want perfect fidelity for what was in the room. I would take a picture. Someone who was a really good artist could draw it, and they could paint it with an airbrush or oil paints, and would be pretty realistic. My wife could do it with watercolor, and it would look pretty good. I could do it, and it would look like a 4-year-old, did it with crayons, right? It was just my skill is so low, and so it's sort of like maybe I'm not reproducing exactly the apple and the bowl of fruit was in the room, but I'm like, okay, there was an apple. Let me draw an apple. Oh wow, that's a terrible apple. How could I make that better? When I go to create the conversation on paper, I still will use the same part of my brain that generates conversations. Like I will need to create dialogue. And that dialogue I create will reflect my genuine skill in real conversations. So even if the words are totally different, what I record will be no more skillful than what I'm able to produce. So it's just sort of like whether I drew the apple in the room looking at the apple, or I drew the apple in my kitchen looking at a different apple, I'm still very bad at drawing apples. So I will generate bad dialogue, but then I'll analyze it and be, wow, that was bad. I'm not very good at this. How could I improve this? How could I be better? So I don't know if that helps. That we have the same skill in our real conversations that we have in our fake conversations. In fact, sometimes, let's be clear, we often recommend to people to do the conversation before you have the conversation. We'll say, think of either a conversation where you were frustrated, or think of a conversation you're dreading. Now, write the dialogue of that conversation you're dreading. How does it go? Why was it bad? And you will still get the value of writing up that conversation and then analyzing your skill and be like, oh, here's mistakes that I'm making. So I'm not sure if that.
To clarify, when Jeffrey says that he's bad at conversations, he means he himself is bad at conversations.
Yeah,
I myself am bad at conversations, even though we wrote a book on it and have been studying it for 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
So the fact that we're bad at it is a universal fact. It's not like people who are learning it anew are bad at it. Everyone is bad at it all the time. The trick is to get slightly less bad by analyzing and repeating that analysis for a long time, which sounds a lot like learning to be more mindful.
And to use another analogy, we often make the analogy to skiing. So if you go to a ski resort, you'll have green beginner slopes, and people who are just new will make lots of mistakes on the greens. As you get a little bit better, greens aren't so bad, but you go up to the blues and blue squares, and now you're having trouble. And then you get better at that, and now you go to black diamonds, and you'll make mistakes there. And then there's always harder and harder slopes to try to ski, and there's harder and harder conversations. So the more I care about the topic, the more under threat I feel, the harder it is. If I'm surprised by a conversation, the harder it is. So my level of skill doesn't mean that all conversations are easy. It might make some easier, but there will still be ones that are challenging for where I'm at. So if I get surprised where someone, out of the blue comes to me and says like, you did a really bad thing and I feel like I'm being unfairly attacked, I'm going to have trouble reacting skillfully. I'm going to be really hooked and like, what? I'm going to defend myself. And, then I'll have to go back later and be like, oh, how could I have handled that better? There will always be something to improve at.
Are we answering your question at all, Bob? How did we do?
Well, communications is the greatest challenge in the whole world. So I didn't imagine you had an answer for it. But I mean, every business I've ever worked with has had communication problems.
Yeah.
The second you have, sometimes with one person.
Self-communication.
Sometimes I can have trouble with myself in that regard. But the thing that I'm trying to get my head around is you record the conversation as you perceived it, even though you acknowledge on the front end that is not what happened.
Yeah, because the conversation you heard isn't the one that happened either.
Yeah.
So when you were in the conversation, so the conversation we're having right now, Bob, where you've asked a couple of times, what do you do? How do you keep the fidelity high and so on? Look, I'm not even replacing. I'm not even.
I'm not even in the fidelity range.
Yeah. See, I got it wrong. I just got it wrong right there. That wasn't an intentional mistake. That was an actual mistake because I haven't been hearing you as well as I possibly could. In a perfect being would be able to replay for you like it was on a tape recorder what you said.
You mean like
interpreting
AI?
based on well, let me tell you, come back to Chat GPT. I've got something on that.
All right,
so just remind me, we should come back there. But because there's actually real benefit from that. But the key thing is that the conversation always happens in your head. The conversation always is interpreted by the part of your brain that is inexpert at this, doesn't do it well. And
we don't perceive reality directly.
Exactly. Just to take another simple analogy, your eyes do not see the room that you're in. So, if I look, I'm not seeing, except for this tiny little space, the computer in front of me and the microphone over here and the water bottle over there. My brain is filling those in because my eyes are actually moving around little saccades and they're actually scanning the room. But my brain perceives it as if I can see the whole room, but I can't. That's where you get optical illusions. Same thing happens with conversational illusions. I thought you said something about fidelity. You didn't. Then we could go back and check the recording. I'm sure you didn't say that. But because I've been thinking about that, and that's something that's a bias for me for whatever reason, I picked that up and said, oh, Bob's interested in the high fidelity recording. But it's not. That's going to happen over and over and over again. And when I record this conversation to analyze it, if I were to do so, I'm going to make the same mistakes, even if I don't remember exactly what Bob said. So I know this is really counterintuitive. I'm happy to talk about it more, but the trick is you don't need to have accurate information. You just need to make the same mistakes.
Yeah, and I think just being open that your interpretation of the conversation is likely highly flawed is useful. Just knowing that you're picking up and filling in the blanks in your head of things that you assumed were said but were never actually spoken. You jump to a lot of conclusions based on your history and your experience leading up to this point. So you're validating, and I think that process of sitting down and validating is very helpful. So let's jump over to Chat GPT because that's the topic of the world right now, and how the fact that AI oftentimes will have an answer that seems more accurate than a human being when I type it in, and perhaps how this
it's expressed very confidently, right? But not infrequently, it's completely made up.
It's very confident in its inaccuracy. And my wife,
and it sounds great.
Yeah, my wife is the same way sometimes. She's 100% confident in what she's saying when she knows, and we find out later it's not true. But the idea that
I'm not going to touch that one. I don't want to get in trouble with your wife.
We've had these conversations. She's great. The role-playing piece, maybe this is where ChatGPT comes in. So
exactly right. So there's something people keep missing about it, just because it sounds so convincingly human that people think, oh, this is now going to write all our blog posts. It's going to invent new ideas. It's somehow going to replace humans who do those things. I don't think it's going to do that at all, because it has this hallucinatory capacity. where it makes up stuff, and it will tell you very confidently that there's this paper written by this person, and it'll give you the citation, it'll tell you which page number and everything. It's all made up. It doesn't exist. So the challenge is that there's something else that it's really good at, which is why it hallucinates, and that is it's the world's greatest actor. And you imagine, I'll just pick an example that I'm excited about. There's a guy called Benedict Cumberbatch. He acts in lots of movies. One he acted in.
Yeah, we know
well, the one I'm going to refer to is called the Imitation Game,
yes,
where he played Alan Turing, who was the guy who said, "Hey, maybe if we could talk to a computer, then we could conclude the computer is thinking." So this is kind of relevant to this whole world. The computer can pass the Turing test now. But when Cumberbatch was depicting Turing, he was just reading the script and then inventing a character. He never met the actual Turing, and he died long before Cumberbatch was around. So he's making up a character, and he's responding as that character. If we had him here on the podcast, we might say, and we asked him to be Alan Turing, we might say, hey, Alan, what primary school did you go to? And he'd make up an answer. It would sound like Alan Turing. It would be completely made up, because I'm sure he didn't look up what primary school he went to. But he could tell us about his favorite teacher and his favorite color and how he used the crayons, and you could tell us all that stuff. It would all be made up. But it would sound a lot like Alan Turing. That's what this machine is really good at. That's what ChatGPT and Bard and Bing and all these things are actually really good at. So if you rely on them for actual information, if I wanted to find out about Alan Turing's life, I shouldn't ask Benedict Cumberbatch. That would not give me a lot of valid information. But if I want to practice talking to Alan Turing, there's nobody better, right? He's a super skilled actor. He understands Turing very well, at least as portrayed in the movie. And so he could be a convincing Alan Turing for me. We've got a machine that can do that for any character in the world, and multiple ones at the same time. So it could ask one to be Brian. I could ask it to be Brian and Bob. And when you're responding as Brian, do this. And when you're responding as Bob, do that. And make sure that you yell at me a bit about this topic, at least 3 minutes into the conversation, and go. And then I can go practice. Now, I haven't done a lot of this yet because the stuff is so new. But I'm starting to tell my coaching clients, hey, try this out. I don't think it's well developed yet. I think that we'll see a lot of innovation in this space in the next year, where you can actually go and program it to be somebody that you want. It'll have kind of an angry boss setting, and you can just say, be the angry boss, and it'll know. You won't have to come up with it yourself. But today you can try that, and you get quite valuable sparring partners. And so we've always said it's extremely valuable, and it still is. It's still a really good thing to rehearse your conversations the way you'd like them to be. So I might go back and say, oh, I want to rehearse talking to Bob, and I don't want to use the word fidelity. If you notice I say the word fidelity, Jeffrey, stop me, because that's where I'm making a mistake. I'm not listening to Bob very well. I'm missing something. So you be Bob, and when I screw up, you tell me. And that works great. We should still do that. That's really, really valuable. But I'm starting to think that you can also do that with these large language models. We don't know that yet, but that's where it seems to be going.
Well, people I've heard are practicing interviews on them now.
I think that would be a really useful thing to do. But yeah, especially bad interviews, right? The interview where you screw up, that would be the one to try. You don't want to have a good interview. You want to have a bad one and recover or analyze.
Well, and it's capable of passing the bar exam, we've recently heard. I mean, so it's sort of. If it's based on knowledge alone, it's good. But I think the role-playing piece that you talk about in this book, it does potentially open up a real good way to apply the role-playing piece, which can be hard to pull off, but ChatGPT is free and we can all use it for that purpose. Troy and John, you guys have been nice and quiet. Do you want any questions based on what you've heard? Any ideas? These guys are both retired, so they're in a different world, but.
No, I wouldn't say willfully retired at the moment, but that's another issue there. I'd like to try to ask, or I personally haven't read the book, but how do you will? I will actually. I can think of ways you've alluded to on how this could not just in the workplace, be very practical for family conversations, significant spousal conversations, etc. Very interested there. I'm also interested in the emotional intelligence component, or other, I would call other techniques within the workplace that people may. Is there any other resource there that may be advantageous as you're walking into these conversations, if you have more of an emotional awareness about that other individual and how they generally interact, or Is there any information like that that might be helpful?
I'll let Jeffrey do much more on this because he's got a lot more. I will just give the brief answer for me, which is include emotion in your conversations. So many people try to suck it out, and that makes it much worse. Jeffrey, you've got a lot more on this, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot in this. I think one of the key skills in that when you're having a conversation with someone is around empathy, which is to try to understand the story that they're telling themselves related to their emotions. Like I like there's a definition that says like a feeling is a sensation in your body. An emotion is a feeling with a story. So and trying to understand the story that someone's telling. And it fits well with what we talk about in the book. One of the fundamental exercises we talk about is, are you being transparent and are you being curious? And so the way that might go together is, okay, so I'm guessing that the story you're telling yourself is this. Is that right? And the great thing is this is like a free action in a conversation. If you're right, the person feels really understood. And you do a lot to get closer together to have a productive conversation. If you're wrong, they don't hold it against you. They just correct you.
Yeah, which we saw live here. Bob and I did not set this up ahead of time, but I misinterpreted what Bob was telling us. And that was useful. I don't think Bob trusts me less. I hope not. He hasn't hung up. But I hope what Bob feels is Squirrel's trying to understand and he's got it a bit wrong. I'm going to help it. Is that true, Bob, or am I misunderstanding?
No, I think you nailed it. I mean, I look at this chat GDP or GPT thing and I say, how can you put any credence in something that you start with 80% and here's your word fidelity in their data? I mean, I asked it for a resume for Bill Gates and it told me he graduated from Harvard. Yeah. He's the most famous dropout of Harvard.
Of course. Planet. Well, don't believe it about anything, just like you wouldn't believe Benedict Cumberbatch about touring, right?
Right,
It's not a source of information. It's a source of acting.
That's where I have this issue with what's being called AI these days. It is really got some bad rabbit holes, I guess is the best way to put it, that it can head down. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, if you use this to help practice dialogue, first, you're doing it in text rather than verbally, so that's one problem with it.
It's not a problem. It's actually a big help. So we can go into that if you want.
Okay. How is it not a drawback to it?
So it's the same thing we were talking about before. We have a theme going here. So and
right.
you and Jeffrey and I may disagree. That's completely fine. But let me tell you how it looks to us, having practiced it a lot. Low fidelity, going back to fidelity again. Low accuracy, sort of fitting it through the thin pipe of your conversation through the thin pipe of text, which has also gone through your own brain. That's really useful because it makes it simpler to analyze. There's all kinds of nuance and complication and difficulties that come about because we're on a screen and maybe you're on the wrong part of the screen or the camera's slightly off, so you've got me not very well lit. Many factors are confounding in our conversation. But there's a very simple one. I didn't hear you right. I wasn't listening very well. So and that comes through in text, and it's much simpler to see there rather than Squirrel with his shirt slightly unbuttoned and feeling a little tired because it was a long day and it's the evening in England and 5 other things. That's a lot of context that actually confounds the situation. The situation is I'm trying to listen to Bob and answer his question and I'm not doing very well. So I want to get that as clearly and as succinctly and as black and white as I can. And I'm going to do that better if I'm in text. So that's why, for example, although email has many very bad characteristics and Slack has even worse, one saving grace of them is you can look at the words and they're in very clear letters, right? It's not you misinterpret the handwriting or you didn't hear the person correctly or something. It's like, he said, Squirrel, you're an idiot. Great. I know that he thinks I'm an idiot. I don't have to say, did I hear midiot or quidiot or something? What was it? No, Squirrel's an idiot. Okay. I have something I can deal with. So I'm a big fan of lower bandwidth, simpler communication.
And if I turned on closed caption right now, you would have the text of every word that was spoken to the accuracy of the transcriber in real time. But that's a more expensive Zoom application.
It is. And you don't need it. Again, it's useful to get it lower bandwidth and get it through the brain of a human so that you can expose the mistakes.
I'm really curious, the two of you, as you were writing this book, because you were co-authors. And how did you use eat your own dog food to some extent of the things that you were writing about to help you get through this process, because it can be very difficult to co-author a book. In fact, I would say being in publishing, less than 50% of the books that start out ever see the light of day when there's co-authors.
Jeffrey knows about that.
Well, this is my third attempt at a book, so
Yeah.
I have 2 prior failures, so I'm right there with you. So,
But those are great, because the great opportunity that gave you was to know what wouldn't work.
that's right.
And so you didn't have failures, you had successful experiments with a negative result.
That's right.
That's what I tell my clients over and over again.
But one thing I
here's
think
the
was useful for us is that we have a podcast.
Yeah.
So actually,
273 episodes, I think.
So Troubleshooting Agile podcast, and that was one time a working title for the book was Troubleshooting Agile. We would often work through ideas in conversation on the podcast, and then we would know what we wanted to say in the book. So that was a big help of how we worked this out. So in applying it, the idea is the value of conversations, and we would have conversations.
Indeed. And the other most important thing is, it's in chapter 3, that you're not going to get very far if you don't have trust. So if we actually deal with the issue that we don't trust each other, and the causes of that, and dealing with how that comes to be through things as simple as Jeffrey's hand up and saying something's obvious, which I remember him evolving. If you can do that over a period of time, then it becomes much easier to work on a book. And I don't remember, Jeffrey, you tell me if I've got it wrong, I don't remember any massive conflicts. I don't remember us having unproductive conflict over the book. I remember us saying, should this be in chapter 3 or chapter 5? Or are you going to write this part, or am I going to write that part? We had negotiations, but I thought they were all very productive conflicts. So I didn't find the process of writing the book painful at all.
No, I don't think so. And I would say that
Jeffrey?
and to go back to Agile for a moment, I think we were pretty agile, and we evolved the book over time. It was originally called Sprinting in Place.
Still want that title.
Was the first working title, and then we Troubleshooting Agile, and eventually Agile Conversations. And so that we evolved it, tried small things. We had sample chapters, and then an outline, and evolved it over time. The way that people would say to evolve, and therefore embracing change as it went along.
Well, we had been working together for 15 years by that point, I think, if I remember right, from when we started the book, from when you met me.
Yeah, we met in
at least that
2006.
Yeah, so 14, 15 years of working together and having unproductive conflicts. I can remember several of those, not about the book, because we got those all out of the way early, built the trust, built the foundation, and then the collaboration was much easier. But there was a huge investment up front. So we did a lot to make that happen, and studied it and worked hard at it and screwed it up a lot. Well, kudos to you for keeping it it's relatively brief. The reality is, the 2 authors, you could have easily had something twice this size, and you pared it way down to something. Yes, we did. That you can actually use, because it drives me nuts when I get a 400-page book. Now, you talked about the benefit of rehearsing a conversation before it happens. One of the things I was drawn to was Bezos' famous 6-page memo that he would send out before his executive meetings. You had to, like, the first 20 minutes of the meeting, they just sat down and read the written narrative of the meeting. Is that something you guys support, and can this basically be utilized or not? So I'm not a fan, and I started rejecting it as soon as you're halfway through your sentence. So maybe I need to learn to be better on interrupting. But I think you could use some of these techniques in that environment. If that works for you, I'm not going to argue. I'd be perfectly happy with that. But if somebody came to me and said, what would be a good way for me to organize my my meetings and my discussions? Silence for 6 or 10 or 20 minutes at the beginning wouldn't match our philosophy, because you notice the second word of the book is conversations. So we'd kind of like the people to be talking and discussing and having productive conflicts about what's in the paper. I'm in favor of reading something beforehand. That sounds great. Be more prepared for the conversation. But I'd rather have the conversation. I don't know. Maybe Jeffrey disagrees.
I think I'm indifferent. I think the advantage of the Amazon approach is acknowledging the reality and fallibility of humans, that even if you send something to people to read ahead of time, not everyone will. And often for, good reasons. Things came up. There are other things that are important. So what you're doing is saying, look, it's really important that we have shared understanding, right? It's literally, we want to be on the same page. Right now when we're talking, are we both looking at page 3, paragraph 4? Like, that's actually, our conversations are trying to get to that point. Right? We want people to be sharing their experiences and sharing their facts. That's a key element. The value of transparency is to say, like, well, here's what I know about the situation. Someone else says, well, here's what I know. If you've compiled that ahead of time into a document that you're all looking at, you've done a lot of the work. So I think there's a lot of advantages to it. I think there's other ways to get on the same page. And, I think there's a trade-off. If you're skillful at conversations, then you can draw out only those things that were relevant. And maybe you get the equivalent of what would have been one page, but you put it up on the whiteboard and you work it out together. We often have, in a company I was at before, we would have a shared document in every meeting. And we would be multiple people could be typing in relevant facts. So we would essentially be generating the document in the meeting. Perhaps that was more efficient. So I'll just say the real goal is, are you getting shared facts? Are you sharing your different experiences? I'm kind of indifferent to how you get there. So that's my
it comes down to the keys accountability, right? So after those meetings, those shared documents, action items, so something actually comes out of it and people understand what their roles are, where they're accountable to move the ball forward, right? That's a big part of what you guys do.
And I say the accountability in the meeting, which is to share what you know and share your view. And it's not just even if you disagree, but especially if you disagree. To go back to what I said earlier, like the value of diversity. We would sometimes say this: we're going to have this discussion. We should pretend like one person has a secret fact that only they know, and it would totally change what our outcome would be. Now, how are we going to run?
Go further than that sometimes, Jeffrey. You know this. I'll tell people there is a secret fact, and I've told somebody that if we manage to discover it, everyone will have ice cream. And I wait a few moments, and then I say, well, actually, let me fill you in. I actually haven't done that, and there isn't any ice cream, but I want you all to behave as if you had believed what I said, which you did a moment ago. So what were you thinking of doing in order to get the ice cream? Do that.
How do we structure the conversation such that if one person had specialized knowledge, we would find that most relevant thing and apply it? And that's the way I look at the conversations, is we don't really know what's going to end up shaping the outcome. And so it's a discovery process. How do we discover what we all know till we can make collectively the best decision?
Wonderful. Bob, any last questions? We're getting up to the hour. These guys have been very
I have one quick question, well, not quick question. It seems to me that almost everybody faces these communication problems. It's universal, pretty much across the board. In your studying of the problem, have you found any major sources? And specifically, I want to ask about schools that teach people that there's a right answer and that they're out to be the smartest kid in the room, not part of the team. Are we setting the stage for difficulties there? Because you two just made a big point of the fact that you knew each other and got to know each other deeply before you went to writing a book, which was the tough task at the end of it. Without that experience, could you have done it?
I think we could now, because we, in addition to what we did over those years, is we were studying this material. So Brian's question was, how did you apply it? Well, we applied it by practicing, having unproductive conversations, writing them down in this way and improving them. And so when we came to do it, it was easier. If we were to write, I think it was for me, if I were to write with a different co-author who hadn't got this trust with me, I would be working in the same way. I'd be using these same techniques, and therefore it would be easier. But, how many hours do we have to talk about where these things come from, and are they from schools? The one thing I will say is that a very common tendency, and it's come up a lot here, and I'm not beating you up, Bob, for it in any sense, but it's just a very common tendency, is to think, well, where's the structural cause of this? What meeting could we hold? What book could we read? What document could we write beforehand? How could we train people better? How could we have different schooling? How could we address these problems in a structural way? And if people take nothing else away, the structure isn't the problem. That's my view, at least. That having better schools would be great, and we could talk about that in a whole nother podcast. But that's not going to remove the human tendency, the natural evolution that has caused us to favor fear over trust, to not make commitments, to not be accountable. There's lots of reasons that human brains, as they are shaped inside our heads, don't behave that way. And all the schooling in the world, all the documents you read beforehand, all the structures of the meetings are not going to change that. What changes that is learning a skill, which is just as hard as skiing. We don't evolve knowing how to ski. We have to go learn it. And you have to learn how to have conversations the same way.
Thank you. Well, if people want to learn more about you two and Squirrel, now is a good time to plug your newsletter. Why don't you both share a little bit about, and mainly Squirrel, I think Jeffrey's kind of a low-key guy. He doesn't.
I keep trying to get him to do more consulting, so keep asking him to do
All
more.
right. But Squirrel, how people can get in touch with you and learn more about.
Well, actually, I'm going to suggest Jeffrey does our common website, and then I'll do a little bit about some other things. Would that be okay, Jeffrey?
Yeah, absolutely. So our common website is agileconversations.com, and there you'll find links to our podcast, transcripts of past episodes, a link to the meetup that I run once a month for people to practice this. That's where these papers come from. Is we have a conversational dojo that I run every month on Meetup, and a lot of other resources that you can download that are videos and whatnot. So that's the first home for our joint work together is agileconversations.com.
There you go. And that's where you can find our individual websites and so on. I do an additional thing, which is squirrelsquadron.com. So squadron like the fleet of planes in the air. And Squirrel Squadron is my community of people who are in tech and not in tech. And we get them together and they learn from each other. What a crazy idea. No one else seems to do that, but I don't know why. So that's what I've done. And that's all free. They're free weekly events. There's, as you say, a newsletter. There's a forum. There's tons of material there for practicing, putting all this material that we've talked about to practical use. So how do you actually run your tech team differently? How do you change the marketing of your organization? How do you get strategy for your leadership team so that it actually functions and has accountability? Those are all the kinds of questions that we deal with there. So I would love to see people at squirrelsquadron.com too.
All right. And that Bob is probably chomping at the bit to explain to you what SoftTech exists for is to connect the techies with the non-techies. And that's what we've been doing at Central Coast in a face-to-face forum, but we've been doing it for now over 30 years. And we have them called SoftTech moments when there's a light bulb that goes off in the connection that's made, whether it's asynchronously or real time in our meetups. And we get together every 3 months now. And our next meetup is going to be in June 10th, on the topic of artificial intelligence. And we're going to have a panel be talking about a lot of things that are going to continue to evolve. And I tell you, I don't think a day goes by that I don't have some conversation around it. And I do think it's definitely going to revolutionize the world, especially in the publishing side of things. So it is pretty dramatic. But you both have been really great today. I can tell you're skilled in this process of yourself, which make you great guests to have on the podcast. And I look forward to listening to some of your podcasts.
Super. Great questions. Enjoyed them very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to Tech Reads, sponsored by SoftTech. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe and share it with your colleagues. If you have comments, questions, or want to suggest an author for a future episode, visit SoftTech at softec.org and click on the Tech Reads link.